Atomic batteries to power, turbines to speed. This is the Uncolored Podcast. All right, here we go again. Thanks for coming back. My name's Kevin Metcalf. I'm the host. Last week, I spent a whole lot of time. I spent the whole podcast on the Uncolored Sports segment of the podcast. You know, I love the sports thing, and it always backs up because that's what I watch the most of, and it just had piled up. So I figured I'd just do a whole podcast and get that out of the way while I was working on the big idea. But there was a big breakthrough. I don't know if it's a breakthrough. I mean, it's a breakthrough for me. Everybody else probably already knew this already, but for me, there was a big breakthrough on the big idea side of this thing, which really is the genesis for this whole podcast. So I was able to kind of tighten it up and have it ready for this podcast. And what happened was there was two of them were podcasts that I heard. One was from Quillette, and the other two were YouTube videos from a guy named John McWhorter. And both of them crystallized what I've been thinking, which is kind of nice, because when I started this whole idea, there's no new ideas. When this whole thing started to, form in my head, I don't know what to say. I kind of felt like I was a little bit on an island. But as I do more reading, as I listen to more lectures, it's starting to crystallize. It's almost like, if you've ever done an investigation, and I'm not even talking about from, listen, my background's law enforcement, so I that's how I see it. But, if you're working at a corporation or a company and you've got to dig up data or do a presentation, or if you're, doing a project for school, it's the same kind of thing. You have some kind of an idea, and then you're trying to gather data that either, helps you form it, support the idea. You got to change it, all this kind of thing. But it's nice to know that you weren't on an island, that there was something there, some kernel of truth that you can develop. And it's nice to know when you find other people who, there are smart folks. John McWhorter's, he's as smart as you can get. It makes you feel, it kind of legitimizes it. You're walking alone on this island, all of a sudden somebody else appears walking along too, with the same idea, so you don't feel so bad. And that's what happened over the weekend. Well, actually, over the last couple of weeks. So I'm going to share that with you because it nails home the point that I started with, which is all of this stuff that we're talking about, I think is just a religious argument. This is all based in religion, and I'll give you an example. I'm reading a book right now by a guy named Henry Hazlitt, and he was an economist back in like the 40s and 50s, I guess. And he's I think he's from the Austrian school of economics. That's very libertarian. And he did a critique, a book. It's called The Failure of the New Economics. And he does a critique of this book, or this idea, or well, actually he does this one book by a guy named Keynes. I don't know what the guy's first name is, but Keynesian economics is a big, school of economics, and it's more of a government, kind of a socialist base. It basically says the government needs to control or have more control over what the money and the markets do. And in the 30s and 40s, this was a big boon for socialists and Marxists, because their whole thing is they want the government to control everything anyway. So when Keynes came out with his theory, that was not directly opposed to, but in many ways opposed to free market principles. The socialists loved that. That was a big boon for them, and it gained huge popularity. So Henry Hazlitt writes this book, and what's so funny about it is normally, like when you read, I think Hayek, when he wrote The Road to Serfdom, it's a very gracious and courteous, disagreement. He makes sure not to ruffle any feathers with his socialist friends and things like that. He's very polite. But Henry, I mean, he walks in, into Keynes's curio shop with a baseball bat and a full bladder, man, and just unloads. He goes after Keynes like he owes him, well, like he owes him money in economics. It's so funny to read because you can see the disdain, not that Hazlitt has for Keynes as a person, but just his idea. Hazlitt has no room for the Keynesian school of economics, and he just page by page just destroys it. And what was so funny about it, as I'm reading it, look, it happened around, after World War II. The Depression is part of, the subject matter or the object of these books and ideas. And when you think about it, it's not like the Depression and the war and the economics of that time weren't different for Keynesians and different for, classical economists. All of the factors, all of the things that were going on with people, they're exactly the same. So the objective data was exactly the same, yet they came to almost diametrically opposed conclusions about the causes and the solutions of them. And to me, that's not because the data is different. It's because they come from different points of view. And in my opinion, they're religious points of view. I think one view, and I said this before with when Adam Smith referred to the invisible hand, and this is the idea that all of the uncountable, the millions and millions and millions of decisions that are made by individuals that go to make up what we see as the market, prices, is referred to as the invisible hand, kind of coordinates and all of this data emerges as what everything is worth. That's a principle, I think, or at least that's my thesis, that goes back to the idea that there's something beyond human beings that we interact with or that interacts with us that creates the world that emerges in front of us. That's kind of a weird way to say it, but I think that's what I'm trying to say. Whereas you have another way of thinking that says there is nothing beyond humans and material things. And what that leads to is a mindset that because only humans, we're the top, thing going on here in the planet, then every solution has to be a human solution. And that solution has to come from a group of people who are somehow smarter than everybody else, whether it's a government or an organization, that kind of a thing. There's always a smart group of people who know better than everybody else, and everybody else should just shut the hell up and let the smart people fix everything for them. And that's a basic, I'm in no way an economist, but as I read and understand Keynes, that's kind of the general gist behind it. It's that the government will fix everything for everybody, which is, in my opinion, derivative of Marxist ideology. But my point is that the problem isn't that there's different data that people are looking at. It's that their mindset or the a priori assumptions of what I believe are religious ideas are what causes the conflict between people in economics, politics, social things, and all that stuff. So that's really the basis of this. And so just to give a little bit of history, or at least to go back over when I say religion, people always think about, going to church. And I think it's worth it to spend a couple of moments to identify what I mean when I'm talking about when I say religious ideas and religion in general. So, as I've said before in previous podcasts, religion isn't just those folks dressing up on Sunday and going to church and reading out of a book. It seems as though religion is whatever that is beyond our knowledge that's empirical data, right? Tables, chairs, those kinds of things, the sun spinning around the earth, all of those things are objective facts, at least as far as we know. The religious part of it, I think, enters into it when there's that phenomena that we can't quite explain by the objective data. For example, consciousness. Nobody knows what the hell that is. Right? We don't know what dreams are, really. There are explanations, but we really don't know what that is. And what we use is our imagination to kind of figure out how it all works. And what it seems that happens, not only in those two areas that I talked about, but just in general, that religions come about with a sort of an amalgamation of human intuition and trying to, you're trying to make the things that you see fit an explanation that seems to work. And I think if you get enough of the right people to sign on to an idea, who have the right, social capital, whether they happen to be, if you're in a religious community or, if it's a, educational background, they got PhDs or whatever, or political clout, whatever it is, if you get enough people signing on to an idea, then everybody else is a bunch of knuckleheads. I mean, most of us were idiots, let's be honest. None of us really understand what we believe and why we believe it. It's usually because there's somebody that we like who believes it too. So we feel okay believing it. That's why I think Hollywood's such a big, well, I don't want to get into that. But my point is most of us believe what we believe, not because we've, went in depth and read and studied and really thought about it. Usually we believe what we believe because somebody that we respect or like a lot or has some sort of an authority figure has told us that's the way things are, and we've never questioned it. And so I think that's how we come to be. There seems to be some sort of a connection between, again, an intuition, some sort of an idea that says this is what seems to be true, and the collection of data and phenomena that we experience on a daily basis. Now, here's the thing. I think that's the normal way of functioning. I mean, I don't think how else can you, move throughout the world. There's some things you know, some things you don't know, and you've got to figure out some way to reconcile the two. And I think a belief system sort of, is sort of that bridge. But here's the problem. Before I use the word hunch, or with regard to, that's how police sometimes offer. You see on the police, on a TV show, the police go, "I had a hunch." That's that intuition. In science, it's a theory or a hypothesis. They observe some sort of thing that happens in the physical world, and then they develop some idea about how it seems to work. Then they call it a hypothesis, but it's mostly intuition. Same thing with a police officer. In religion, I think the same thing happens on a larger scale. But here's the difference. With a scientist, at least what they're supposed to do, is that their intuition should be subject to the objective data. Meaning if the objective data matches with their intuition, then it's a good hypothesis. It turns into a theory. And it stays that way until you find something that proves it wrong. Same thing for a police officer. If you're doing it right, you have an idea of what you think happened, and then you look at all of the data, and you either confirm or you have to, broaden or change or whatever it is. But the point is that your intuition isn't the supreme deciding factor. It's subject to the data, in other words. I think religion does it differently. What religion does is it makes that intuition supreme. In other words, whatever a person or a group of people think seems to be right, whatever their intuition says, that remains supreme. And then they only look for whatever data supports that intuition, that a priori assumption that they've made. And then all of the data that suggests that assumption is wrong, that whatever seems to be right isn't correct, they ignore it, they attack it, they generally have antipathy towards it. And that's when you're in the area of religion, where objective data only is good when it supports your intuition. That's where I think you get into the era of religion. And as I say, I think most, if not all of us, operate that way. We fall in love with our intuition. We fall in love with the way things seem to be. And the moment something comes across that says that things may not be that way, we get really upset about it. And there's a world and a history full of conflicts and horrors that I think are evidence of that. And my point is, again, it's not about some objective disagreement. It's about us having our a priori assumptions, our intuitions, in conflict with empirical data that says those intuitions are wrong and need to be changed. I think that that's the way things work. So from that idea, I started to look at a lot of these conflicts, anti-racism, what is it? The new PC culture. It's not really new. It's been around for about 20, 30 years now. The social justice movement, feminism. I started to look at all of these organizations and ideologies, much of politics, and it seems to be, at least so far as I'm looking into these things, all of them fit that mode. Everything fits right exactly within that framework of intuition clashing with objective data. And so today, before I get in, this will lead me into my whole thing on race that I keep saying that I'm going to do that I never quite do. This was one that I had seen for a long time. You know, when I was probably my 30s, I would guess. I was raised in San Jose, California, born and raised San Jose, California. And all of my friends were, all kind of different races, Hispanic, Filipino. I remember a kid named Levi Aurelianeta, junior high school. We hung out together all the time. He was a Filipino kid. Raymond Mondragon was my best buddy for a bunch of years, and he lived right across the street. He was Hispanic. But anyway, my whole point is, living in San Jose growing up, everybody was different. There was no one particular race or group that was dominant, at least not in my experience. There's a lot of Hispanics there, but, it doesn't seem like there's any more than anybody else around there. And so my point is that when I grew up, I didn't grow up with any of the stereotypical understanding of who being black was or what whites were, any of that stuff. I had wonderful, wonderful, wonderful people who were all different races. And then I had a bunch of assholes that I ran into who were all different races. So for me, the race was not that important. Now, I'm not going to pretend like, hey, I'm not racist. I'm not going to pretend I'm the only one who's not racist. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that the stereotypical, that's not really stereotypical, but the black ideology that many grow up with and that for whatever reason is all the rage today in the media, I never grew up with that. I never grew up feeling I was a victim. My mom and dad worked their asses off. And I know my dad, who grew up in the South, was, like most black men and women from that era, were steeped in racism all of the time. And talking to my dad, he'll tell you that, when people cry about racism today, they're full of shit because they don't know what the hell racism was like compared to what they had to go through. So my father kept me in a very cool environment where he just had me worrying about school and staying out of trouble. But I always heard from my friends, my brothers were a little bit like this. One of my brothers were, two of them were. And there were also people that I was around who were black who always had that victim, resentment that, the whites are against us and we're always victims and it's always because I'm black. And you'd hear that all the time. And while I was around that all the time, for me, again, it wasn't true for me. And it wasn't true for a lot of black folks that I knew, even though they, sang the song of victimology. I knew it wasn't true for them. But I never really knew I didn't know anyone else or any way of really articulating how that was until I came across two books. The first book was called The Content of Our Character by, why can't I remember his name? Hold on for 1 second. Let me get the guy's name. Shelby Steele. That's who it is. The Content of Our Character by Shelby Steele. An incredible book. And as I read through this book, I don't even know why I started reading it. Everything he was saying clicked. It made sense that racism is overblown today. It's way overblown today. It's used as a political and social crowbar more than anything to extract resources from other people. That there's this huge, there's a group of white folks who want to expiate their guilt by patting black folks on the head and pretending that blacks have no responsibility for anything. They make excuses for black people. They lower the standards for black people. They in fact, because of their white guilt, are more racist than they would let themselves think they are. They automatically believe that black folks can't do what white folks do, and that they need some sort of helping hand, like we all should be wearing disabled, placards around our necks. That's how these guilty whites treat us. And that's the experience that I had, that white folks were no more good or no more evil than black folks. There's some evil black folks out there too, just like there's some great black people out there. In other words, people are people. And much of what we hear today is a bunch of BS. Now, the second book that I read that really helped me understand what my experience was a book called Losing the Race by Dr. John McWhorter. Now, John McWhorter is, he's a linguist by profession. I think he's one of the world's leading linguists. But he's also a black man. And as I read the book, apparently had the same or similar experience that I did. That racism is just overblown. Again, not non-existent, but just overblown. And so it was a great book. And from time to time, I'll listen to his lectures. Although, listen, and I love John McWhorter, and I think he's great for what he does and what he's doing. I disagree with him on a couple of his areas, but I really respect him because he seems to be the type of person who he's looking to understand the reality and not the rhetoric. Boy, that was, I'm going to coin that. He's looking to understand the reality and not the rhetoric. Even though I disagree with him on some areas, he's honest, he's courageous. And so I love what he is. But anyway, so I'm looking at one of his YouTube videos, and he says exactly what I was thinking. He understands anti-racism today as a religion. Now, this clip goes on for a little bit, so I encourage you to hang in there. Actually, you don't have to. It's a great clip, but it goes on for just a little bit. But I want you to get the full context of what he's saying about anti-racism today and why he believes it's a religion. And I'll put the clip. I'll put the link to the clip. I don't know, somewhere. But here's Dr. McWhorter.
I think when we discuss racism in America and whether it exists and to what extent and how important it is, the first thing on a lot of our minds is racism from the police. And so I think we need to talk about that first. And there's some things that I don't think we always know. Tamir Rice was a black boy of about 12 who was brandishing a toy weapon, and he was shot dead. The exact same thing happened to a boy named Daniel Shaver not long after that. Daniel Shaver was white. Sam DuBose was shot dead by the police driving his car away from a cop. The exact same thing happened, actually a little bit before that, to a white guy named Andrew Thomas. Alton Sterling was a black man who reached into his waistband and reached for his wallet during an altercation with the cops, and the cops shot him dead. That was a grievous event. And the same thing actually happened around the same time to a white guy named Dylan Noble. Alton Sterling made national headlines. None of us heard about Dylan Noble. George Zimmerman said some really nasty things about unspecified little people and how they're always going around stealing things before he ended up killing Trayvon Martin. Now, that was a terrible thing, especially because a policeman said the same sorts of things, including using the word fucker, before he killed a white teenager named Lauren Simpson. I could do this for 20 minutes. There is a very understandable tendency in the media to report stories of black people unjustly killed by the police. Whereas what we don't know is that for every one of those events, there is a white teenager or 20-something who is killed under almost ominously similar conditions where you've really got to dig to find it out. Now, I'm not saying that there's fake news or some grand conspiracy. I understand why the media are so concerned with the black cases. But I'm bringing this up because I think that generally we are often told that any conversation about race is shut down by the purported racist tendencies of cops who, in a hair-trigger situation, will allow their quiet bias to kill a black guy when, if it were a white guy, he would get away with a slap on the hand. That's a very reasonable assumption. But you know, that really hasn't held up to scrutiny, and it's why I allowed myself to do this particular debate with this particular question. Even the numbers are quite different from what we hear. And so, for example, there is the issue of proportion. So, white men, 62% of the male population. They are half of the people who get killed by cops. Black men, 13%, and they are a quarter of the people who are killed by cops. And so it's disproportionate. So one might think, well, that means that still there is a racist bias against black men because so many more of them are killed proportionately. But no, not really. There's a debate team trick that's going on in relation to that. Because it wasn't so long ago that when we talked about welfare, disproportionate amount of black people were on welfare, but more white people were on welfare numerically. So if anybody pointed out that a disproportionate number of black people were on welfare, it was always pointed out by a certain crowd that no, actually, many more white people are on welfare, and that was considered a smackdown comment. And that means that we have to question the idea that what this is all about is underlying pernicious biases of the cops. I almost can't believe I'm saying this because I spent a very long time thinking what a lot of people think about the cops. I have a reputation for saying that racism is as important as people make it, but I always made an exception for the cops. And not too long ago, I had one of my blogging heads conversations with Glenn Lowry, where I told him, Glenn, you've got to give me figures if that's not true. And I didn't know that the figures actually exist. And so I had to really make an adjustment, really think in a new way about this kind of thing. What we're told about the cops simply isn't true. Anti-racism, as currently configured, has gone a long way from what used to be considered intelligent and sincere civil rights activism. Today, it's a religion, and I don't mean that as a rhetorical feint. I mean that it actually is what any naive anthropologist would recognize as a faith in people, many of whom don't think of themselves as religious, but Galileo would recognize them quite easily. For example, the idea that the responsible white person is supposed to attest to their white privilege and realize that it can never go away and feel eternally guilty about it, that's original sin right there. The idea that there is going to be a day when America comes to terms with race, or that there could be. What does that even mean? What is the meaning of the coming to terms? What would that consist of? Who would come to them? What would the terms be? At what date would this be? The only reason that anybody says that is because it corresponds to our conception of Judgment Day, and it's equally abstract. When we use the word problematic, especially since about 2008 or 9, what we're really saying is blasphemous. It's really the exact same term. Or the suspension of disbelief that is a characteristic of religious faith. There's an extent to which logic is considered no longer to apply. That's how we talk about racism. And so suppose someone asked, Why are we to focus on the occasional rogue cop who kills a black man when 9 times out of 10, that black man is in much more danger of being killed by another black man in his neighborhood? Gosh, that's not pretty, but like many things that aren't pretty, it's also true. If you ask about it, well, you know you're not supposed to. Eyes roll, and you're given an answer that doesn't really completely make sense, and there's an etiquette that you're supposed to stop there. It's rather like certain questions that you ask a priest very gently, but you know that if you don't get a real answer, then you're just supposed to move on. That we're used to with being devoutly religious. That is the way racism is treated these days. It's a religion. And many of us might say, after thinking about it, you might realize that even if you're somebody who looks on devout religious faith among, say, a Mormon or a fundamentalist as something peculiar, you read books by anthropologists exploring this frame of mind, even if you realize, it might even be pleasant to realize about yourself that you are religious just like them. If you wonder how a Mormon feels, to be an anti-racist today is to be ideologically a very, very similar person. If you're a good anti-racist, then you're thinking about the cops that kill black men in these scenes that we know about. But you're not supposed to think about the fact that so much more murder happens to men like that in their own neighborhoods. You're supposed to think of that as maybe connected to racism in some abstract way, but you're not supposed to think about it. You're not supposed to think about all of those homicides. Every summer in big cities across America, teenage black boys are killing one another in the hundreds over, frankly, nothing. That's somehow less important than what the occasional rogue cop does. That's modern anti-racism for you. That's backwards. Another example, education. To be an anti-racist is to pay attention to the idea that universities must foster diversity. The idea being that supposedly universities wouldn't want to foster this diversity if they weren't made to do so. Now, what that means is that often this diversity is fostered as the result of creating a different evaluation system for black and often Latino students in terms of grades and test scores. Now, there are various studies that show that that often is not the best thing. And so Stephen Cole and Eleanor Barber did a paper where, contrary to their expectations, it showed that when students are mismatched to a university, it discourages them from getting PhDs. There have been many studies of that kind, but we're told to look away from them. So after racial preferences were banned in the University of California, before they were banned at the University of California, San Diego, in a freshman class of 3,268 students, of the freshman honors students, exactly 1 was black. In 1999, this is the first class admitted after the ban, when students were matched to a school according to their grades and test scores rather than there being the kind of bonus that we see. We're now seeing it at Harvard. 1 out of 5 black freshmen were making honors. Why have you never heard of that statistic? It's actually a beautiful story. These are black students who did very well, who wouldn't have done as well at Berkeley or UCLA. There's no tragedy. Those students are now out working and living wonderful lives. Anti-racism teaches us not to listen to stories like those. This is what I mean by saying that anti-racism is a problem. Anti-racism, as currently configured, not anti-racism just in itself, but modern anti-racism turns a blind eye to most black homicide. Anti-racism, as currently configured, turns a blind eye to black young people's upward mobility. It turns a blind eye to doing the kinds of things that civil rights leaders of 50 years ago considered ordinary in favor of what is ultimately an inwardly focused quest for moral absolution that has at best a diagonal relationship to helping people who've been left behind. For that reason, the issue here, I must repeat, is not whether or not racism exists. The issue is whether modern anti-racism is the best way of combating the effects of that racism. And it isn't.
So that's Dr. McWhorter on anti-racism. And you can see what he does. What he does is he begins by listing or talking about what you hear anti-racists talk about. Cops hating, hunting down black folks. Letting black folks into colleges. What do you call that? I forgot the word for that. Affirmative action. That's the thing. And he talks about affirmative action, how that hurts, about how we need affirmative action. You got to let more black kids, the diversity issue. All of these things that you hear with regard to racism and anti-racism and the fight against racism, and how it's only a teeny tiny part of the story. And much of that teeny part of the story is totally false. In other words, the idea that cops are, suiting up going, boy, I'm going to kill a black guy today if I can, is insane. I'm talking about generally speaking. There's aberrations and horrors in every group of people that you want to pick out. And cops are no different. Okay, but the idea that if you see a white cop, he's looking to kill a black person, you're an idiot. It's a product of a religious movement. And the same thing goes with education. That somehow when you force black kids into colleges that are way beyond their ability, I shouldn't even say way beyond, I don't know. I mean, listen, I didn't make it through college. I went to San Jose State and I was like, 6 months, probably more like a year from graduating from the commercial design program before I became a cop. And so when you think about it, I'm a college art school dropout, so I have no right to talk about education. I didn't quite make it myself. My point is this: the idea that you're putting in black kids into schools for which they're not qualified, so that they don't graduate, it's a stupid idea on its face. But if you're religiously motivated by the idea that every problem that black folks have is a product of racial discrimination, you're going to come up with these stupid solutions for things that actually end up hurting the people that you, quote unquote, intend to help. And I don't really believe the idea that they intend to help them. I don't believe that at all. But that's the prevailing wisdom, that these are well-intended people who just simply come up with bad ideas. And again, I'm not even going to go into that one. But here's what I'm saying. You have a group of people who have established an orthodoxy based on an intuition that is not true. But that intuition is supported by just that small portion of the data that supports their a priori assumption. That's religion. And all of the data that says that is not true, they don't want to hear it, they don't want you to hear it, and they don't want anybody talking about it. That's a religious organization. That's a religious mindset. I only want to know the things that support what I already believe. And if it doesn't, I'm going to be very angry if you talk about it. That's the whole reason why, and I don't know if they even say it anymore, but when I was a kid coming up, they'd say, hey, listen, you don't talk about religion and politics in mixed company. And the reason is because it's the same thing. It's not about objective data. It's about what people want to be true. They don't care what is actually true. And that's why it's a religious mindset and not about, anti-race. Heather McDonald, I got some stuff from Heather McDonald. She writes for, she writes for a bunch of places, but she's got a book called The War on Cops. And the book just goes, from cover to cover, just a whole bunch of factual data and evidence that talks about what the cops do to help these cities, and the lack of police in certain areas causes more crime. It talks about how the biggest fear that a young black man has today is another young black man. And that's been that way for decades. And you don't want to hear about it. Or nobody in the anti-racism religion wants you to hear about it. Nobody wants you to hear about the fact that 7 out of 10 black children grow up without a father. And it's been like that since the 60s. And it's only gotten worse. But no, none of the guilty white liberals will even mention it, because that doesn't help them ameliorate their guilt that they put on themselves for some insane reason. It doesn't help them feel less guilty by saying, hey, guess what? If more black men helped raise their kids, we'd have less problems. You'll never hear that, when in fact, that's the absolute truth. And so my point again is, when you're having these discussions about race, you're not talking about objective social issues. You're talking about religious beliefs. That's my whole point. Here's another example. This is from a podcast called Words and Numbers. It's a podcast from a website that I go to quite a bit called fee.org. FEE.org. It stands for Foundation for Economic Education. It was founded by the guy who wrote a little book. It's really not a book. It's like a missive called iPencil, talking about, free market concepts, ideas, and how, pencils came about. It's a great little thing everybody should read, called iPencil. But anyway, the guy who wrote that founded this place called fee.org, and they've got a podcast. They've got a couple, but one of the podcasts they have is called Words and Numbers, where they just talk about economics and how they apply to things of the day. They're interviewing this guy named Donald Boudreaux. Donald Boudreaux is a professor, I guess. I don't know what he does. He's, teacher, I guess, at George Mason University. And George Mason University is also probably the most prominent, I don't know. I think Chicago. The University of Chicago would have something to say about it. But George Mason University has one of the best economic programs in the country, if not the world, along with the University of Chicago. But Donald Boudreaux had an experience, and he wrote about it in an article in the fee.org website. And Dr. Boudreaux also comes to the same conclusion, that we're talking about religion here.
This week, Donald Boudreaux joins us. Don is professor of economics at George Mason University and a senior fellow with the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason. Don, welcome to Words and Numbers.
I'm very happy to be here.
It's good to have you here. The reason we wanted to have you here today, the thing we wanted you to talk about with us, just recently you published something over at fee.org that was about Brett Kavanaugh coming on board at the GMU School of Law to teach a course and the uproar that ensued. And apparently there was a petition passed around asking faculty to sign off against that hire. Maybe you'll tell us what happened over there and what your take on it was.
A couple of weeks ago, I was sitting at my computer and I got an email. It was very upbeat. Hey, help us out here. They wanted me to sign a petition for the university to prevent the George Mason Law School from hiring Brett Kavanaugh to teach as a visiting professor. I immediately wrote this person back saying that while I have some disagreements with Kavanaugh's jurisprudence, I will not sign the petition, and I will not sign it because there's no reason for me, and by implication, anyone else who may be asked to sign the petition, to suppose that Dean Henry Butler and his colleagues at the law school have made an inappropriate or mistaken decision to hire Justice Kavanaugh. Justice Kavanaugh is convicted of no crime. While the accusations are heinous, if they are true, there's no evidence that they are true. Don't think it is my role as an economics professor to have any say whatsoever in how the law school conducts its affairs, as long as the law school is conducting its affairs within the broad boundaries of propriety. And I see this as within the broad bounds of propriety.
When anybody can level an accusation, and then the accusation itself is enough to disqualify somebody from just about anything.
We know it does. Read the paper this morning, had some racism of my own 2 weeks ago. That's not the issue.
But if we take a step back and say, all right, this is not an isolated incident, it's just simply emblematic of a larger move on college campuses, because when I look around, I see people being shut down and shouted down on political grounds all the time. In the sorts of things that we used to discuss openly and freely on college campuses, now we've, I think, functionally cordoned off certain avenues of inquiry because of virtue signaling. So maybe if we're to think about how we got here, a broader brush is in order.
So one thought I have, actually I was thinking about this earlier today, is that whatever is that part of the human psyche, that part of the human psychology that throughout history have caused religious persecutions, the witch hunts of the Middle Ages, and the people to burn others because they had a different belief about the nature of the consecrated host, things that we regard today as banal, they are in play here. The same psychology that caused religious persecutions in the past is at play here. It's a religious fervor that causes people to fight so fervently and so ferociously against ideas that they find to be out of step with what they believe.
And Dr. Boudreaux comes to the exact same conclusion. and it's funny because like Dr. Boudreaux, like Dr. McWhorter, say the same thing. It's not like when you disagree with these religious nuts, it's not like they go, oh, really? There's other data that we haven't looked at? Well, let's talk about it. No, you're evil. You shouldn't be talked to. We've got to silence you. We've got to take you off of Twitter because you're talking about data that we don't agree with. We really don't like the assumptions. We don't like the implications of this other data that we've chosen to ignore and hide. It's not that you disagree. You're evil. And there's always a name they call you. You know, if you dare to say, hey, you know, this global warming stuff seems a little nonsensical, that we would know that whatever temperature it is today, that it's not supposed to be that temperature. I'm not sure how we would know that. It's not that you have a legitimate question. No, you're a, what do they call them? You're a denier. There's no question of any data. Well, no, let's look objectively. No. You're a denier because you're going against our a priori assumptions. That's our religion. We don't want you touching it. Same thing. No different. And last but not least, because all good things come in threes, there's a comedian in England. And this is fun. I didn't know you can do this. What he does is he goes on Twitter and he creates a phony account. And the name he gives it is Titania McGrath. And Titania McGrath is this, super woke social justice warrior. But it's this white rich girl, who's got no, it's basically the typical guilty white liberal who takes up all these social causes so they can gain some of their moral, purity back. So he creates this gal, even writes a book. And I guess what he does, if you look at the Twitter, the tweets, I guess they call them. If you look at the tweets, it's just insane. He's obviously being satirical, but I guess there's a lot of people who didn't get it. And he even wrote a book called Woke, and somebody found out about it and outed him. And, he took a lot of heat, but it was just like I guess it's a joke he's doing. I guess you can create different phony accounts on Twitter. And apparently he's not the only person who does that kind of a thing. But go to Twitter and look up Titania. Yeah. Go look up Titania McGrath on Twitter. It's funny as hell. There all these contradictory tweets. As the religion obviously is, the social justice wokeness is obviously fraught with contradictions. And all this comedian, Andrew Doyle, all he's doing is pointing out all these contradictions in a funny way. It's funny as hell. But he talks about the blowback that he gets from these social justice nutcases and how he compares it to not just a religion. Andrew Doyle goes as far as to call it a cult. And I agree with him 100%. So this is what he has. This is what Andrew Doyle says about it.
In April 2018, a new parody account appeared on Twitter with the name Titania McGrath. Describing herself as a radical intersectionalist poet committed to feminism, social justice, and armed peaceful protest, Titania embodied a particular type that many people on Twitter will be familiar with. A privileged white woman, usually a graduate of an elite university with a successful media career, who is constantly complaining about white supremacy and oppression. Last week, Titania published her first book, Woke, A Guide to Social Justice, and a newspaper revealed the identity of her creator, a 40-year-old stand-up comedian called Andrew Doyle, with a PhD from Oxford in Renaissance poetry.
But has there been kind of a sort of backlash on Twitter since your expose? Have people started actually getting genuinely angry about the fact that you're not actually a 24-year-old girl?
Well, they're more furious about the character and about it's basically people who are angry at the politics of the character. The character is mocking this sort of cultish identity politics, and I do see it as a cult. I think that's the best way to understand it, as a religious cult, because they are utterly humorless about it. They are completely convinced about their own particular worldview. They want to proselytize. They want to convert people to how they think. They think that if you don't think their way, that they are evil. It has all the hallmarks of a cult. And of course, as with often with cults, they don't know that they're in a cult. So it's a bit like me telling a religious zealot your God doesn't exist. So of course they're not going to find it funny, and and that's their right. You can go on Twitter, say it's unfunny, say it's terrible, whatever. But it's very interesting that by doing so and getting so obviously agitated by it, it is sort of suggesting to me that I'm doing something right. Because my view of the whole woke politics is that it is the establishment.
So yet again, and I could do this all day long with different people talking about the reaction they get from simply disagreeing with whatever the current social, political dogma is. They don't get people looking at data and talking about what the objective data says, what the empirical data says. What they get is name calling. They get anger. They'll, if you're a scientist and you challenge the theory of evolution, which is getting a lot of that now, you lose your position. I did a podcast on that where a doctor had his own school on the website basically disavow him because it didn't talk about his data, but because he was challenging evolution, they're like, hey, we got nothing to do with this guy. Because we're not talking about objective data. All of these conflicts revolve around different religious ideas that are fighting. So when you hear people like Ben Shapiro, who I love, when he says that America is having a decline in religion, I disagree wholeheartedly. I think religion is on the rise, like you wouldn't believe. It's just that all of these new religions are insane. That there are these insane cults that people are believing in simply because it feels right, or they're getting some sort of emotional vig out of it. And they 100% contradict all of the data, all of the evidence that is objectively there for everybody to see. And what happens is if you dare to point it out, if you dare to bring up the fact that black kids are killing other black kids like it's a sport, there's something wrong with you. If you happen to mention that, possibly the reason that there's so many black folks in jail is because there's not enough black men raising their own families. Nobody wants to hear that. If you say somebody that, hey, listen, global warming, this has been, there's a lot of data that says that this is just the normal patterns, and actually CO2 is really great for plants and stuff. Nobody wants to hear it because it goes against their religious ideology. And there's one reason that everybody has these religious ideologies, in my opinion. Now, I haven't quite developed what it is, but I think I know what it is. I think I know what all of these religions are about, whether it's an economic religion like Marxism, whether it's the new woke culture, whether it's the anti-racism culture. All of these new religions have cropped up for one specific reason. But I'm going to get into that in a couple of podcasts down the road because I want to develop it want to have a little bit more evidence before I go ahead with it. So that's really the whole. That's the big idea today. I'm glad I got back to the big idea because I'd gone off of it for a little bit. But listening to these 3 podcasts, and trust me, I could spend 5 or 6 hours just playing you clips of different people in different walks of life in all different areas who are saying, listen, these religious nutcases are coming out of the woodwork and they all want one thing. They want to shut you down. They want to keep you from expressing your opinion. They want to keep you, and if you dare express your opinion, they want to get you out of your job. They want to remove from you your ability to gain employment. They just want you totally out. They want to get rid of you. You're going to get booted off of whatever the social media networks that they like now. All this stuff is going on. Not because people are wrong, but because there's this new wave of crazy ass religions that have taken hold of the public. And we think we're having objective discussions about data. Not even close. This is a new religious nuttiness, like the witch trials of Salem years ago. Same exact thing. A bunch of nutty people getting a hold of society and trying to beat the hell out of people who don't believe in their particular religion. So, thanks for listening. I'm gonna end it right there. Next week I'll come back with another podcast. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions, you can get a hold of me at uncoloredmedia@gmail.com. That's uncoloredmedia@gmail.com. Again, my name's Kevin. Oh, and you can subscribe to the podcast on whatever the outlets are: iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, all that stuff. But other than that, thanks for listening. This is Kevin Metcalf, and this is the Uncolored Podcast.